Hi, buddy. Jeff Allen here. There've been a lot of, I've got my whole book here on quality assessment, a simplified approach. The name of it, I can't remember the exact name. It's something like it's a video playlist, so I kind of optimize the name. It's something like a simplified approach to quality evaluation using customer satisfaction, customer experience, and sales approaches, something like that, right? So I might find a shorter, cooler name, but I'm kind of working on that. But the a lot of the videos in this series are not all of them, but they're all related to quality evaluation, quality assessment in some way. And a lot of them are related to all kinds of topics of testing and quality and all that. But a few of them I'm specifically focusing on the language field or the language industry because that's where I do a lot of my work, and that's where there's a lot of need to talk about quality and how to deal with it. Um, and so there's been a lot of webinars recently, a lot of conference talks about quality evaluation, quality assessment. I mean, I don't want to. There are lots of words for this. They all kind of they're aiming at the same thing, right? And the about automated translation, which is also called machine translation, and how to evaluate that quality by the users who are doing the post editing of that. Those that you don't know this, don't worry. I'm trying to focus this on the people that do know what I'm talking about, right? In this book, there are specific chapters related to certain areas, so don't worry about it. But in that, there's been a lot of things, and I want to do a shout out to R. Lamo, who did God, I can't remember which. Arl, I think this was not part of another sponsor series. I think this was the CSA sponsored webinar on that you had about MT in the month of October, if I recall correctly, of 2022. End of October, beginning in November. I'm kind of lost in where we are in all these webinars because there's so many of them right now. This is kind of the moment of all the webinars and conferences, right? And you mentioned what you were doing on translation. Well, during this session with a bunch of, you had Vincent Godard, and you have, let's see, Alain Levy, and you had Jay, and you had who else? Spence. So I'm just trying to remember who was in the talk. That helps me, recall what it was about. Sorry, I got the cough. I'm still got the results of my bronchitis. The and then you talked about during that you were having some things come about translation grading. Okay, so I want to address that, and uh, I'll address it. I want to discuss or mention this and what I've done about this 30 years ago. Yes, 30 years ago. Now there's a lot of talk about different levels. J2450, SE2450, which I think is a little too complex at the beginning. You can use it in the end, right? But I think there are cycles, and I talk about this in my book, the right times to do these at certain points in the cycle for certain types of purposes. But I think it's not good to use up front for the sanity checking and smoke test checking and all that. See the book, my book, I talk about this. The video book, or playlist. But in this, you mentioned translation grading, and I want to come to this because I think this is really key. Um, and because we have this in the language learning area, and I was a language teacher for my first decade of my work. And I didn't do just university stuff. I did university training. I taught at several universities. I mean, Portland State isn't really well known. I was a French instructor at Indiana University, which is kind of pretty well known for the French language. Number one kind of the states for that, and then taught at University of Leon too. But I taught actually in a lot of business schools, professional private business schools for professionals, right, for executives, especially in France. Did that for a number of years while I'm doing my master's and my doctoral work. And I taught at the Graduate Business School of Lyon as well. So, I mean, there were some programs that were really business focused for NEDAP. And what I did at the University of Lyon too, and I've actually never talked about this, and I just want to bring it up. So I'm bringing it up with my Halloween COVID cough, right? So got to kind of filter through that. And what I did at the University of Lyon too, I mean, I don't want to say this is completely innovative. Maybe it seems innovative. Maybe it was pretty innovative 30 years ago, actually, in in all the language learning area. I think it was pretty innovative back then. Um, Possibly innovative back then. Now it's kind of par for the course. So I don't think it's really. I never actually did an article or a paper on it. I should have, but I didn't. Okay, so I mean, I got lots of those. I kept me busy. But the what I did at the University of Lyon too, when I was doing, I had hundreds of students in the university. So, and they all had to take the English class for the linguistics program. So, and I want to set this scene to explain why I did this, because I think this is important for what purposes it's good for. And it might not be good for other purposes, because I did not use this. Well, I did not completely use this in other contexts of one-to-one. I kind of did, I didn't. I kind of, I'll say is I used it when I had to do a lot of evaluation of a lot of students, kind of volume. But I didn't use this chart specifically when I did one-on-one sessions with the executives. I did use it in my mind, but I didn't write it down because it wasn't important for a one-on-one, because you can do feedback. You read it immediately and you have more time to do the feedback. And the professionals, they want that feedback, right? Whereas the students don't really care. They just want the grade, right? So, but it helped me kind of time box and put time on the things I needed to do the grading, and to do in a way that was systematic. And I think this is really important, because we can use this for MT, machine translation, no problem. It's the same issue. And I've used this actually over the years with MT without saying, hey, I did this back in University of Lyon 2, so I'm saying I did it in Lyon 2, right? University of Lyon 2. So what I did, so I got to set the scene, but I've taken a few minutes to explain this, right? Because I think this is important. Explain why I did something is just as important as explain the results of it. It's sometimes quite necessary because it's not always applicable in all places. So I think this is key. But I think now it can be extended. Sorry for my cough. It's actually sounds worse than it is. Just ongoing little thing, and we've got medicine trying to cover it. So what I did was I had literally hundreds of students that had to give these, and I had them do oral presentations. Okay. They just had to come and do a 10, 15 minute oral presentation on a topic they wanted to do. I let them talk about whatever they wanted to. Open thing. I just wanted them to, and I did a lot of the language classes. I did a lot of stuff with the comic books and comic strips and music, lyrics, all kinds of stuff. Sorry, the cough. To get people interested in things that are kind of everyday life. Because taking language class or a mandatory language class is a kind of boring thing for students. They have to do it. They don't want to do it. So I wanted to do things that motivated them first. Music and all that kind of helps. And gamifying things with comic strips helps. So because it's kind of a game. But what I did is I had them come to kind of their main grade of the quarter or the semester, and they could choose any topic they wanted to, and they just had to talk for 10, 15 minutes ish. I can't remember. Yeah, about 10, 15 minutes. I had a couple hundred of them, probably 200. And what we did was I created this grid, this evaluation grid or grading grid, matrix, whatever you want to call it. And I had been thinking about this going back as far back as the Portland State University in 1980, actually 88 and 89. Wow, it's been that far. Where I'd been working on it. And what I found was that when we grade things, there's too much focus on grading on certain things like pronunciation, surface level stuff, surface level behavior, rather than underlying competency and skills, right? This all the whole Chomsky thing, right? Is it innate grammar or is it Skinner's behaviorism? Okay. I'm kind of citing things here because I think it's important to cite some of the references, right? So there's that whole kind of thing of, was it Chomsky's innate language faculty, or was it Skinner's behaviorism, where we are doing things at a behavior level. Oh, well, Chomsky actually separates the two. He separates them to talk about there's a level of competency and there's a couple of, what you do at the surface level, which is just spoken, right? But it doesn't mean that you got it wrong. It just means that that one point in time, you may have not expressed it as it sounds like a native, but then you might do it another moment. It sounds like a native, right? And even native speakers do this too, right? Sometimes it just doesn't come out as we call these glitches, right? Or in French, we call them lapses. So I can't remember, memory holes, whatever we want to call it. I don't want to cite everybody that, all different references. I can't remember every single one, but then page numbers or whatever. But so what I did was, rather than focus on specific things, I looked at it as a holistic approach. Gestalt, I guess, was the word I used a lot at that time. Gestaltic, holistic approach. But I had different categories. But the categories were really simple. This is the key. This is where it's very different than J2450 thing, which you have to go and actually detail the things out. And you have to go down and actually do the looking at each sentence and then giving a rate of the specific on a point scale, a lot of point scale. This is very different. What I did was I don't have an example here, but I'm just trying to explain this, right? So I made a pretty simple graph, or just an index of 5. I think it was 5 different things. Off the top of my head, I'd have to go back and look at some examples if I still have the examples, so I could recreate it again. I had one about fluency. I had one called fluency. And I actually used it in my German class when I actually took German. When I took the test to take the German, I actually used this as a teacher. I use this, so it's really funny. So I have one called, well, no, let's not use fluency. Let's call grammar. So I have one called grammar, okay? And grammar, and I would just make a note every time I heard something that did not sound native approximative, okay? Did not sound native. So every time in grammar, I just had a little thing. I could pick a bunch of little lines. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 with the cross. 1, 2, 3, 4. I know just the number of times I heard something in those 10 to 15 minutes that did not sound how a native would do it. I just make a mark, right, and count them up. If it did not sound native, and then at the end I could make an overall score of that thing, right? I had another one called pronunciation. How's the pronunciation? Because that's a different thing than grammar, right? So I had one called how's the pronunciation? Does it sound native or near native or approximate native or not? Is it far from sounding the sound completely wrong? Completely wrong? Mark. Boom, 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 boom. 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. During this 10-minute session. And so I could count up the number of them, right? I had another one called, so I had grammar, pronunciation, that one called fluency. And fluency is just how fluent it sounded, right? Okay. Did it sound natural? Or did it sound like there was tilt and had to think? Had to stop and think about things, right? And especially with a bunch of filler words, I kept it. If they had filler words, that's fluent because people do filler words, right? So if they were filling up the stuff and keeping it fluent, if it didn't sound fluent, then I make a mark. If it didn't sound, a bug, right? Didn't sound fluent, I put a mark. So negative stuff, put the mark. Another one I did was, did they have comprehension? Did they understand what I was asking them to do during my question? Did they understand my question or not? Because I would ask them questions at the beginning. Even though they knew that they could talk about anything, I'd ask them some questions. Sometimes I think they could even do this when I was asking just spontaneous questions. Because, and I say this very specifically, comprehension is a very important one for language learning because I had this happen when I took a German exam to get into a class. I'll give the example of why I did that, because I came to the German class and I had never studied German, but I knew German enough to get by and buy food and stuff. And the person asked me a bunch of questions. I knew what they were asking me because I used to be a language teacher. I knew it's all these kinds of questions. What's your name? Where are you from? All this stuff. But I didn't understand what they're saying because I didn't know the vocabulary. And so I said to them in French, I said, look, for a German teacher, I said, look, I don't understand what you're saying because that's a comprehension level, but here's what I know. And I told them what I knew. And then they put me in the higher class. So comprehension is a really important thing because sometimes someone can ask you a question or make a statement, and you might come back with a statement that's completely off track, right? But your fluency and your pronunciation, your grammar is perfect, right? Just excellent. But the fact that you didn't understand the question or the statement means that you gave a wrong answer to the question. That's comprehension related. It's not related to these other things at all. So I make a separate category. Did they understand the topic, the ongoing topic, or not? Really, did they not understand it? So if they didn't understand it and they made things that are coming back that were completely off track or weren't in the kind of the sequencing you do of that kind of topic, if they had a bad mark, I give them a bad mark. So I had these 5, okay, I can't remember, it's 4, 5, 6 topics. And then I had each one of them. So what I did is I didn't have to give an immediate grade, right? I just had to mark the number of raw data items that I had were negative to get an assessment, actual detailed assessment of that really quickly. This is real quick to do. I mean, while you're doing it, you're listening. You're just making marks of negative stuff, right? Then I can take the 200 students at the end, looking at all the data. Okay, I think this is why it's really important. This is why I'm explaining it. I take all the raw data because I haven't given them a grade yet. I've given them an assessment of only the negative bugs of their production during that 10, 15-minute session, okay? Then I come back to my grading, where I have to grade everybody. Then I begin, now I have all the data, so I haven't made the assessment, I haven't made their grade during the time, because I don't know the other ones I'm going to encounter yet, right? So now I've got everything at the end. And so I can go through and now begin an assessment based on all the averages, because I can look at the curve, right? I can give I can give a kind of a deal with the curve, or what do you want to call it, and have a mean. What's the mean and all this, and the average, and looking at these things, and so then I can establish based on the number of negative points how bad everybody was, right? Which means that I know how good everybody is, because the good is the actual grade at the end, right? But the bad is to determine how low, how much they were off, getting away from what a normal native speaker approximation would normally do in normal circumstances, right? And so then I would give a assessment per thing really quickly, and I give an overall grade based on these 5 points of the negative things. And then the grade was a positive thing based on the negative ones, right? So I could look at everybody at the same time, the 200. And then I give the grades and put them up the board, right? Or put them up, they put them up the wall, but I mean, in the United States, it'd be illegal, right? But I mean, it's how the French do it. So, but give them the grade at the end. And so that's how I did it for language learning. But I separated all these different topics, which do kind of correspond to the J2450 and all these other, lots of these other evaluation systems have blackjack. I mean, there are ones I think of over the years that I've seen and all this. I've never used the LISA quality metric. I've never used it myself, but I've heard a lot about it. So, I mean, it sounds like there's a lot of similarity to all these things. But what is important here is to separate these things that are not related, that fit within an estimation of a quality score, okay? And the risk in all this is to give a score based on one focal point and not on the overall gestaltic approach, right? And not looking at how to separate all these things. So that's why I separated them, and I separated fluency from comprehension. I mean, this is really key. Now, I think that it's possible to take this and to kind of modify it and adapt it to other topics. I mean, I've done this actually for software, telecom software. I've done this in a different way. So it's and I would do it for machine translation, post editing in a slightly different way. again, I don't want to say that there's one way to do this and you have to always do it the same way, but I would say it's important to take all these things and to take it from a customer perspective in that when you're evaluating the quality of what the customer expects, what does the customer expect? What do they want up front? What are they looking for? They are not less are looking for the details of grammar, okay? Or they're not looking for the details of pronunciation per se, but they are looking for accuracy of terminology, right? Vocabulary items, company-specific vocabulary, or named entities, or what do you want to call these things? They're looking for that. That's correct. Now I can apply this to subtitling too in caption, which I did a lot of in the past 4 years. In fact, I've actually implemented this. So not with this grid, but I mean the same concept of the grid, but doing it, underlyingly. And I think that this is really important to separate these things, but not to separate it where it takes so much time to grade it, because this is the issue. If it takes a lot of time to grade, then people won't do it because it's too complex. In situations where you don't want to do the heavy grading at the beginning, right? So I think it's really important to have a kind of a quick filler thing, like it did, boom, 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 negative, bam, 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 get it, and then you do the grading at the end. That's why I think it's really important. I think it's really good because I've had situations many where you do the translation evaluation of MT or whatever, and it's too complex. It's actually way too complex for that for the first round, right? To kind of figure out how bad it is. I think this is why it's key, and it fits in my book here. I think that we should do this later when we've kind of filtered out all the crap and we figure out what the bad stuff is. Then we begin to work on how good it is, and I think this is really important because in the end, the translation grading is based on how good it is, and not how bad it is, right? And I think this is why it's really key. So, again, I'm brainstorming out loud in this kind of book format because it kind of evolves over time. Based on feedback, based on things, based on approaches. And sometimes I say this fits in this purpose, but doesn't fit here, but we'll modify it to fit that one. Because we can always modify and adapt and fit things to fit a new context. But I think if we take it this way, I think this is what you're aiming at, translation grading approach. I'm just taking the language learning grading approach, which back then, 30 years ago, in some of the classes I was giving, that was kind of like a new approach to translation grade or to language learning grading that had never been done before because everyone's focused on these focal points of pronunciation, behaviorism, not competency underneath, and not forget what the competency and maybe the thing that I was able to measure, and I think this is really important, is that someone can give the risk in doing a grade and basing it on one moment in time. Just one moment in time of one sentence, and you hear someone say pronunciation great, you give them a negative note, and then you completely destroy their grade for their entire quarter semester. Whereas what I was doing is I was only acknowledging the raw data of each sentence, each spoken. Even in the sentences, I could have multiple examples of different things. So I had to be really fast to do it. Pump up, pump up, pump up. I had to know my grid really quickly and know my marks. What I was able to do is I was also able to assess, and another thing I did too is if they had lots of notes, lots of negative marks, then that's one thing. If they didn't have that many negative marks, that means it was pretty good, right? So I kind of estimate the volume of the negative points. But however, if they did, and I want to say this, and I'm taking 25 minutes to say this because I think this is really important. This whole grading thing is really important. And I think this is why we're failing at this thing, because we're not doing this way. We're not taking this consideration. We're doing all these individual points and making a grade over something over 1 point, we're just making a mountain out of a molehill over one little problem, right? Where we're not looking at the whole thing. But I did when I made all those negative things, which are just raw details, right? The raw data. It's raw data. Then I'm aggregating that into information, aggregating that into intelligence and all that stuff later on. But I did, even if I was making negative points and finding the bugs. If I heard something that was native approximative during that entire interview of 10, 15 minutes. Then I'd make a note, a special note, saying, they used it. They do know it. It's just that they consistently do the things. So I didn't plummet their entire grade if I heard an example of a good one. They knew it somewhere, but that may have been, and I want to be very, very specific about this, and this is why I'm taking the time to say this. There may have been something, and they've learned it as a lexical chunk somewhere, right? And I'll make another video about lexical chunks. They may have learned it in a lexical chunk, and they heard it there, and they've repeated that because I've heard this as a phrase, a stock phrase. But they don't know it in other contexts, so they make the mistakes in other contexts, but not in the one they've heard as a stock phrase, okay, or a boilerplate phrase, or a template, or whatever, something. And I also take into consideration pronunciation. Under pronunciation, I think one of the advantage for me in language learning is that I grew up in two different locations in the United States of two different dialects. I grew up in the Midwest in Minnesota, and then I grew up on the West Coast in Oregon. So first half of my childhood in one, and the second half of my childhood in the later one, which have different dialects and different pronunciations, like root and route, roof and roof, crick and creek. I have different sentences that I learned in those different contexts that I have the different pronunciation. So I allow that for that and I do know that there are lots of cases, and I will say this, my son, who lives in France, was born here and lived here all his life, has heard my English, right? And he takes English courses, and the teachers will knock him on his pronunciation because it isn't British, right? But it's American. Well, in America has different dialects, right? We all know this. The American Dialect Society, right? I've done the American Dialect Atlas for the speech.com, our database system for speech systems. So, I mean, I know this. But he would get knocked or docked on points because he didn't pronounce it the way the teacher expected it for British, standard British English, right? Which we all know there are dialects of that too, right? But that teacher had no idea of the difference of pronunciation, dialectology, and all this stuff. And so we'll knock him in that. And so this is why I want to take into consideration in my notes is that if I'm hearing during this, and I'm explaining this because it's really important when you grade, doing rating, grading, whatever, is that there may be different pronunciations that you're not necessarily accustomed to hearing all the time. You're aware of them, but you're not. But you can't say they're wrong. They're just different. So if I heard variations as well during this things, and I heard someone say a completely off pronunciation of something, or didn't correspond, like they would say the word shit instead of sheet, right? Okay. Or bitch instead of beach, right? These things, right? Which make people laugh because they're wrong in context. They're actually the wrong sound in the context. But if they use the correct one in another sentence, then I note it as a positive thing. And so that positive noting could affect the final evaluation grade, though there may have been a lot of data about negative points of the bugs within the different categories, right? So I hope this all makes sense. So I don't have a visual for this. Try to explain it as much as I can in a way that is visually oriented. And I hope that this helps us think about grading, evaluation, assessment, all these different words related to not just translation, industry, or field, but content creation, marketing content, styles and preferences. And then I even apply it to a lot of different areas in software and anything, data, whatever. So I think that I hope this helps at least give a framework. I think that we just have to deal with how to do that framework. And of course, all this framework you always modify. So hope that helps. Sorry for the ongoing cough. I'm kind of dealing with that too. Maybe I should do a grading system on my coughs. So we'll see. Thanks so much. Have a good day.